Jackson Hayes believed Grace Miller was a hotel housekeeper. She always kept her head down, pushed her linen cart through the quiet corridors, and rarely spoke to guests. But that night, returning to his room after a late meeting, Jackson found Grace sitting on the floor outside room 312. Her hands trembling, tears falling onto her employee badge. Behind her, the heavy door had just been sealed shut. Before she could rise, a folder slipped from her bag, bearing the hotel's letterhead and the careful signature of a woman everyone in the building believed had died 3 years earlier. If you want to know exactly what secret inside room 312 destroyed Grace's life, stay with this story now. Jackson Hayes arrived at the Grand Wellington for 3 days under the polite fiction of being an ordinary guest, though his real purpose was far heavier than a weekend stay. His investment group was preparing to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to acquire the hotel, and before any signature touched paper, Jackson wanted to see the place with his own eyes, away from polished sales decks and rehearsed tours. Jason Bennett, the general manager, greeted him personally at the entrance, walking him through the marble lobby with the ease of a man who had given this speech many times before. Jason described Grand Wellington as a Chicago institution, a hotel with history in its bones, and he spoke of steady, dependable growth as though the words themselves were proof enough. Jackson listened, nodded, and said little, because he had learned long ago that numbers told the truth long after charm had finished talking. Rather than accept the presidential suite offered to him, Jackson requested a standard room on the 3rd floor. He wanted to experience the property the way an actual guest would, riding the same elevators, walking the same corridors, noticing the same small details that never made it into quarterly reports. It was there, in those quiet hallways, that he first began to notice Grace. She wore the deep gray uniform of the housekeeping staff, her hair pulled back neatly, her posture careful and unassuming. She rarely looked up, rarely spoke beyond what her work required, and moved through the corridors with the kind of quiet efficiency that made her almost invisible. One afternoon, Jackson accidentally spilled coffee near the elevator bank. Grace appeared almost instantly, cleaning the mess without a trace of irritation. When Jackson offered her a tip as an apology, she declined politely, telling him she was simply doing her job. He found the moment mildly surprising, then let it slip from his mind entirely. In that instant, Grace was simply one employee among hundreds, a face he would likely forget by the time he flew home. But small inconsistencies began to gather. When a front desk clerk mistakenly entered the wrong room category into the system, Grace noticed the error from across the lobby without needing to check twice. She seemed to understand the hotel's operational rhythms in a way that had nothing to do with cleaning schedules. Later that same day, Jackson overheard her mention, almost to herself, an old revenue management platform the hotel had stopped using years earlier, a system most current staff would never have reason to know existed. Jason appeared moments later and coldly instructed Grace to return to the housekeeping wing. She said nothing in response, simply nodded and walked away, but Jackson caught the tension between them, brief and sharp, gone as quickly as it appeared. It was a small moment, easy to dismiss, yet it lodged itself in Jackson's mind. Something about the exchange did not fit the story Jason had told him in the lobby, and for the first time since arriving, Jackson found himself watching the quiet woman with the linen cart a little more closely than he intended to. It was nearly 11 at night when Jackson returned to the 3rd floor after a long dinner with his legal team, the kind of meeting filled with numbers, projections, and cautious optimism about the acquisition. The hallway was nearly empty at that hour, lit by soft overhead fixtures and the low hum of the ventilation system. As he passed room 312, he heard something drop to the floor, a small, sharp sound that broke the silence of the corridor. He turned and found Grace sitting against the wall beside the door, her housekeeping cart abandoned a few steps away. She was crying, quietly, the kind of crying a person tries desperately to hide. In her hand was an old brass key, worn smooth at the edges, stamped with the number 312. Jackson asked if she needed help. She rose immediately, wiping her face with the back of her hand, and told him she was fine, that it was nothing at all, that he shouldn't trouble himself. Jackson noticed then that the door to room 312 bore an internal seal, a strip of tape marked with the hotel's maintenance division. It struck him as strange, since the rooms on either side, 311 and 313, remained in normal use. Jason had mentioned earlier that 312 was undergoing electrical repairs, a detail Jackson had accepted without a second thought at the time. As Grace bent to gather her cart, a folder slipped from the bag at her side and landed near Jackson's feet. Before she could snatch it back, he caught sight of the contents. The hotel's letterhead, a revenue report dated 3 years earlier, transaction figures reaching into the hundreds of thousands, and a signature belonging to a woman named Margaret Collins. Jackson knew that name. Margaret had served as the hotel's chief financial officer, and according to records he had reviewed before his trip, she had passed away 3 years prior. He asked Grace, gently but directly, why a member of the housekeeping staff would be carrying old financial documents. Grace's expression shifted from grief to something closer to fear. She reached down and reclaimed the folder, holding it against her chest as though it were something fragile. In a voice barely above a whisper, she told him he should not involve himself in this, that some things were better left alone. The warning only deepened his curiosity rather than easing it. Before walking away, Grace glanced once more at the sealed door, her expression a mixture of grief and dread that seemed to reach far beyond a simple maintenance closure. Jackson stood there a moment longer, turning the scene over in his mind. She had not been crying from exhaustion, nor from some difficult guest earlier in her shift. She had been crying because of that room, because of whatever lay behind that door, and Jackson understood, with a certainty he could not yet explain, that whatever had happened in room 312 3 years earlier was far from finished. The next morning, Jackson quietly approached Joseph Carter, a longtime member of the hotel's engineering staff who had worked at Grand Wellington for well over a decade. He asked, casually at first, what Joseph could tell him about Grace Miller. Joseph's expression changed immediately, a careful guardedness settling over his features. He offered only the safest details at first, that Grace was hardworking, that she was raising her daughter alone, that she never caused trouble for anyone. Jackson pressed further, asking directly what role Grace had held before housekeeping. Joseph fell silent for a long moment, glancing down the hallway before answering. Grace had once worked on the executive floor, he explained. 3 years earlier, she had not been a maid at all, but one of the sharpest operations analysts the hotel had ever employed. She had been the one who first noticed that the reported revenue from several corporate events did not match the hotel's accounting records, a discrepancy that eventually totaled roughly $2.4 million over 18 months. Grace had reported her findings directly to Margaret Collins, the chief financial officer at the time. The two women had begun a quiet, careful investigation together, working outside normal procedures to avoid tipping off whoever was responsible. But before their inquiry could reach a conclusion, something shifted. Digital records suddenly appeared showing that Grace's own login credentials had been used to alter financial figures, and an unusual transfer of funds was traced to an account linked to her name. She was terminated without warning, and quietly warned that pursuing the matter further could result in criminal charges against her. Margaret Collins left the company shortly afterward, under circumstances no one fully explained. Less than 2 months later, staff were informed that she had died of a heart attack. Jason Bennett, who had served as deputy general manager during the scandal, was promoted to general manager almost immediately in its aftermath, stepping into the role with remarkable speed for a man whose predecessor had just been swept away by controversy. Jackson asked the obvious question, why would Grace return to Grand Wellington at all, and why as a housekeeper of all things? Joseph admitted he didn't fully know. What he did know was that roughly 8 months earlier, Grace had applied through an outside cleaning contractor rather than directly through the hotel, a technicality that meant Jason had no legal grounds to keep her out even if he wanted to. Jackson began to suspect that Grace's return was not coincidence but purpose. He pulled the financial disclosures tied to the acquisition and discovered that Jason himself had personally supplied the majority of the reports his investment group was relying on to value the property. If the current figures had been shaped by the same hands that shaped the old ones, then the entire acquisition Jackson had flown in to finalize might be built on a foundation of carefully constructed lies rather than solid numbers. The thought settled over him with quiet, unwelcome weight, and for the first time since arriving, Jackson began to question everything Jason Bennett had told him. He thought back to the coffee spill, to the way Grace had known the layout of the old revenue system without hesitation, to the sharpness in her eyes that no amount of gray uniform could hide. None of it fit the picture of a simple housekeeper, and Jackson realized he had been standing next to the truth for 2 days without recognizing it. Jackson found Grace near the service corridor later that afternoon and asked her, plainly, to explain everything. She refused at first, her guard rising instantly. Jackson told her the truth about who he was, that he was not simply a guest but the representative of the investment group evaluating the purchase of Grand Wellington. Something in Grace's posture changed the moment she understood the weight of what he was telling her. She warned him directly that if his group intended to purchase the hotel based on the reports Jason had provided, they were making a grave mistake. Jackson asked about room 312. This time, Grace finally told him the truth. 3 years earlier, Margaret Collins had uncovered a pattern hidden within the hotel's corporate event bookings. Several large conferences had been recorded at prices well below what clients had actually paid, with the difference quietly funneled through a handful of shell vendors. Jason had personally approved many of those vendor contracts. Margaret and Grace had been too cautious to store evidence on the hotel's internal servers, knowing it could be altered or erased in an instant. Instead, Margaret had periodically booked room 312 under a false guest name on weekends, using the space to copy reports, cross-reference invoices, and keep physical paper records safe from digital tampering. On their final night working together, Margaret told Grace she had finally found decisive proof. But before Grace could reach the room, Jason called her down to his office unexpectedly. By the following morning, Grace had been suspended, every trace of evidence on her work computer had vanished, and room 312 had been sealed shut. She was never permitted inside again. What brought Grace back to the hotel 8 months earlier was an envelope that arrived at her home with no return address. Inside was nothing but the old brass key marked 312 and a single handwritten line. Margaret didn't take everything with her. Grace became convinced that some piece of the original evidence remained hidden inside that room. She had tried repeatedly to gain access over the following months, but the door remained locked every time. On the very night Jackson found her crying in the hallway, Grace had just learned that Jason had ordered the room sealed for renovations starting the next morning. If the walls or fixtures were torn out, whatever evidence remained could be lost forever. Jackson asked why she had never gone to the police. Grace's answer was quiet and exhausted. She had tried 3 years ago and found herself with nothing but suspicion pointed back at her own name. There were no original documents left to support her story, and every digital trail led directly to her own account. The system itself had been turned into a weapon against her, and no one in a position of authority had been willing to look past it. For the first time, Jackson began to understand the tears he had witnessed outside that sealed door. Grace had not been crying over old wounds reopened by memory alone. She had been crying because her final chance to prove her innocence was about to be sealed behind drywall and fresh paint, disappearing the same way the truth had disappeared 3 years before. Jackson looked at her differently now, no longer as a stranger in a gray uniform but as a woman who had spent 3 years carrying a secret too heavy for anyone to hold alone, waiting for one small crack of opportunity to finally set it down. Jackson was not yet fully convinced. He was an investor by training, someone who trusted documents over emotion, and he needed proof rather than a story shaped by grief. He asked Grace to show him whatever records she still had in her possession. She handed him copies she had kept hidden for years: old invoices, archived emails, occupancy reports, and detailed summaries from corporate conferences held during her final year on the executive floor. A pattern emerged quickly once Jackson began cross-referencing the figures. Room occupancy numbers matched official records almost perfectly, but revenue from corporate events consistently dipped during the months Jason had direct oversight. The missing difference resurfaced elsewhere, buried inside vendor payments to outside companies. One name appeared repeatedly: Lakefront Hospitality Solutions. Jackson had his legal team investigate the business and discovered that its original registered owner shared a family connection with Jason Bennett. It was suspicious, certainly troubling, but not yet enough to prove wrongdoing on its own. Jackson made the decision to delay signing the acquisition agreement by 48 hours. Jason sensed almost immediately that something had shifted. He sought Jackson out personally, explaining with practiced calm that Grace was bitter, that she had been dismissed years earlier for embezzlement, and that she was likely attempting some form of quiet revenge against the hotel that had let her go. Jason produced old personnel files to support his account, documents that appeared on the surface remarkably convincing. For a moment, Grace seemed to be exactly what Jason claimed, the woman who had manipulated the system years before. Jackson felt himself wavering. He confronted Grace directly with what Jason had shown him. She was clearly hurt by the accusation, but she did not beg him to believe her. Instead, she simply said that if he trusted those files, he was free to leave, but that he should not sign anything until he had personally seen inside room 312. Something about her composure, her refusal to plead her own case, kept Jackson from walking away. He requested formal access to the room, framing it as a standard due diligence inspection of hotel assets ahead of the transaction. Jason's refusal came quickly and without the smoothness he usually carried into every conversation. He claimed the room had a mold problem, that it was unsafe for anyone to enter. Jackson checked the hotel's maintenance logs later that evening and found no record of any mold report tied to that room, not one line, not one work order, nothing at all. From that moment forward, Jackson stopped investigating Grace Miller. Every question he had once directed at her, every doubt he had allowed Jason to plant in his mind, now turned squarely toward the general manager himself. The 48-hour delay he had requested no longer felt like caution. It felt like the only thing standing between the truth and a permanent renovation crew ready to seal that room's secrets inside its walls forever, and Jackson intended to use every hour of it. He called his legal team back into the office late that night and told them plainly that the acquisition would not move forward until he had walked through that door himself, whatever it cost the timeline, whatever it cost his relationship with the board waiting on his signature back home. For the first time since landing in Chicago, Jackson felt certain he was chasing something real, not a hunch dressed up as diligence, but a truth someone had worked very hard to bury. Jackson used his authority as the buyer's representative to demand an immediate technical inspection of room 312, and Jason found himself with no reasonable way to refuse a second time. The room was opened with several people present: Jackson, Grace, a hotel attorney, an engineer, and Jason himself, standing near the doorway with an expression that had returned to its usual practiced calm. The room had sat empty for nearly 3 years. Dust coated the furniture, several fixtures had already been partially removed in preparation for renovation, and there was no folder, no hidden stack of papers waiting to be found. Jason allowed himself a small, satisfied smile, as though Grace had just proven her own story to be nothing more than desperate imagination. Grace felt something close to despair settle over her, the weight of yet another dead end pressing down after months of quiet hope. Then her eyes landed on the large mirror mounted beside the old desk, and something shifted in her memory. The mirror had been replaced. Margaret had always disliked that particular style of frame because it caught the afternoon light and threw glare across her laptop screen. Grace remembered with sudden clarity that behind the original mirror 3 years earlier, there had been a small technical access panel built into the wall. She asked Jackson to have the engineer remove it. Jason objected immediately, his composure slipping just slightly at the edges. Behind the mirror was a section of drywall that had clearly been patched and repainted at some point in the past. The engineer opened it carefully, and inside the hollow space sat a small moisture-proof pouch, tucked deep enough that a casual search would never have found it. It contained no paper documents at all. Instead, there was an encrypted flash drive, an old cell phone, and a sealed envelope with Grace's name written across the front in familiar handwriting. Grace's hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a letter from Margaret Collins. Margaret had written that if Grace was ever reading these words, it meant the investigation had failed to reach its conclusion while she was still able to fight for it herself. She confirmed plainly that Grace had never taken a single dollar, that her account credentials had been used without her knowledge or consent, and that Margaret herself had backed up the original, unaltered financial records onto the flash drive hidden in that wall. Jason's face lost nearly all of its color, though he quickly insisted the letter could easily be fabricated, a claim made with far less confidence than his earlier denials. Jackson chose not to argue the point in the moment. He simply handed the flash drive to a forensic specialist and requested it be formally sealed as evidence, removing any chance of it quietly disappearing the way the original documents once had. Jason understood in that instant that the situation had moved entirely beyond his control. Later that same night, someone attempted to break into the hotel's records storage room searching for the flash drive, only to find it long gone, already secured off the property in Jackson's possession. Security footage captured the intruder using an executive-level access card, one that belonged to management rather than any ordinary staff member. What had begun as one woman's personal fight for her own name was now unmistakably evolving into a genuine criminal investigation, one that would reach far beyond the walls of room 312. Grace stood in the center of that room, clutching the letter to her chest, and for the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to believe that the truth might actually survive long enough to matter. Jackson watched her and understood that whatever came next, he was no longer simply protecting an investment. He was protecting a woman who had waited 3 years for someone to finally listen. The forensic specialist managed to decrypt the contents of the flash drive within a matter of days. The files told a story far larger than either Jackson or Grace had anticipated: falsified contracts, manipulated invoices, intermediary accounts designed to move money quietly, and detailed system login histories stretching back years. The login data proved especially damning. Grace's credentials had been accessed repeatedly from a computer registered to Jason's own office, at times when Grace herself had not even been present at the hotel. The most significant evidence turned out to be hidden inside the old cell phone. Margaret had recorded a conversation on it, one that captured Jason applying direct pressure on her to approve a questionable payment against her own judgment. In the recording, his voice was unmistakable as he warned that if Grace continued digging into the discrepancies, she would be the one left holding the responsibility for whatever was found. Jackson immediately forwarded the entire collection of evidence to his legal counsel and to the appropriate financial authorities. A significant twist emerged during the following review. Margaret Collins had not died shortly after leaving the hotel, as Grace had always been told. Public records that Jackson uncovered showed she had actually lived for nearly another year, cared for by her sister in Wisconsin, far from the story that had circulated through the hotel's staff. Jason had deliberately spread word of an earlier death to discourage anyone from continuing to search for her or ask further questions. Before she finally passed away, Margaret had entrusted the brass key to room 312 to an old friend, someone who did not manage to locate Grace's new address until roughly 8 months before the present moment. That delay explained why the mysterious envelope had arrived when it did, years after the original scandal rather than immediately following it. When Grace learned the full truth, that Margaret had spent her final months quietly working to protect her even while gravely ill, she broke down in tears once again. It was the first time Jackson had seen her cry since that night outside the sealed door, but this time she was not alone in the hallway. Jackson did not offer empty comfort or rehearsed reassurance. He simply sat beside her and told her quietly that they finally had the proof they needed. The moment marked a clear shift in the connection growing between them. Jackson no longer saw Grace as a hotel employee caught in a difficult situation. He saw a woman who had spent 3 years absorbing an injustice with quiet dignity, refusing to let it break her even when every system around her had failed to protect her. Grace, for her part, began to understand that Jackson's involvement had never come from pity. He had risked his own standing with the investment board, delayed a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and pursued a truth that offered him no personal benefit beyond simply knowing he had done the right thing. In the days that followed, the two of them worked closely together preparing the evidence for formal review, and something steady and unspoken began to grow between them, built not on rescue but on mutual respect, earned through difficulty neither of them had chosen. Late one evening, reviewing documents at a small table near the hotel's back office, Jackson found himself watching Grace organize pages with the same quiet precision she once brought to housekeeping carts and linen counts, and he realized that whatever title she had once held or would hold again, her steadiness had never once wavered beneath the surface, even when everyone around her insisted otherwise. Jason understood that a formal investigation was closing in, and rather than wait for it to arrive, he chose to strike first. An anonymous post appeared online within days, accusing Grace of having stolen money years earlier and suggesting that Jackson was romantically involved with a hotel employee, using that relationship to deliberately sabotage a legitimate business transaction. The accusation spread quickly enough that Jackson's own investment board grew concerned, and members pressed him to step back from leading the deal entirely in order to avoid any appearance of conflicted interest. Jackson suddenly found himself at risk of losing control over the very acquisition he had flown to Chicago to finalize. Grace felt the weight of guilt settle over her, certain she was dragging Jackson into a battle that had never truly been his to fight. She made the decision to resign from her position and leave the hotel entirely, hoping that her absence might quiet the storm surrounding him. Jackson found her at the staff exit, a small bag slung over her shoulder, ready to walk away from Grand Wellington for what she believed would be the final time. She told him plainly that she had already lost her career once, 3 years earlier, and she refused to be the reason he lost his as well. Jackson answered that this had stopped being about her alone a long time ago. If Jason had been capable of falsifying records for years without consequence, then hundreds of employees and every investor involved in this deal were being deceived just as thoroughly as she once had been. Jackson made the decision to publicly announce a delay in the acquisition, forcing the hotel's board to convene an emergency meeting. Jason arrived at that meeting with unwavering confidence, carrying the same old personnel files he had once used to convince Jackson of Grace's supposed guilt. But this time, Jackson had his forensic specialist present, the evidence pulled directly from the flash drive. The timeline laid out before the board was undeniable. Falsified login sessions, altered financial figures, and a network of companies tracing back to accounts connected with Jason himself. One board member asked a simple, pointed question: why exactly had room 312 remained sealed for 3 consecutive years? Jason had no reasonable answer prepared. Moments later, Jackson played the recorded conversation between Jason and Margaret Collins, and a heavy silence settled across the room. Jason understood, watching the faces around the table shift from doubt to certainty, that there was no longer any path back from what had just been revealed. Financial investigators were brought in before the meeting had even fully ended. Jason was suspended from his position on the spot, escorted from the boardroom while staff members outside watched in stunned silence. Grace stood quietly near the back of the room, still dressed in her housekeeping uniform from earlier that morning, unwilling to change simply because the meeting demanded a different appearance. No one in that room looked at her the same way they had only an hour before. For the first time since her return to Grand Wellington, the truth was no longer something she had to fight alone to defend, and the weight she had carried through every silent shift finally began to lift from her shoulders. Jackson crossed the room and stood beside her, saying nothing at all, letting the quiet gesture speak for itself in front of the very people who had once decided her worth based on nothing more than the uniform she wore. It was a small thing, standing together in silence, but for Grace it felt like the first time in 3 years that someone with real influence had chosen to be seen beside her rather than distanced from her. In the weeks that followed, the hotel's accounts underwent a complete independent audit. Investigators uncovered millions of dollars in irregular transactions stretching back years, confirming everything Margaret's hidden records had suggested. Grace was formally cleared of any involvement in the embezzlement, her personnel file corrected to reflect the truth investigators had finally confirmed. Grand Wellington's ownership issued a formal apology, offering to reinstate her to her former position along with back pay to cover the years she had lost. Grace declined the offer, and her answer caught Jackson by surprise. She explained that the past 3 years had changed her in ways that could not simply be reversed by a corrected title or a restored paycheck. She had no desire to return to her old role solely to prove she deserved something more than housekeeping work. The people who had worked beside her during those difficult months, the housekeeping staff who never once treated her with suspicion or distance, had helped her survive at a time when hotel leadership had turned its back on her entirely. She wanted instead to help build a system where employees at every level had a genuine voice, not just those seated behind executive desks. Jackson proposed something different, a newly created position as Director of Employee Operations and Integrity, a role that would allow Grace to oversee internal procedures, manage employee reports and concerns directly, review operational data across departments, and protect staff members from ever facing the kind of retaliation she had endured. Grace accepted only after negotiating the terms herself, insisting on specific protections and authority that she alone identified as necessary. Jackson admired that about her immediately. She had not waited for him to rescue her from anything. She had shaped her own future deliberately and on her own terms. Their relationship developed slowly from that point forward, nothing like the sudden romantic leap so often expected between an executive and an employee. It began with quiet cups of coffee following long meetings, honest disagreements about how the hotel should be run, and evening walks after work that neither of them planned in advance but both began to look forward to. Grace spoke more openly about raising her daughter alone, about the quiet sacrifices that had shaped her daily choices for years. Her daughter appeared only briefly in their story, glimpsed once when Jackson dropped Grace off at home after a particularly long evening, a small warm moment rather than a central event. The focus remained firmly on 2 adults slowly learning to trust each other after everything that had happened. Jackson eventually admitted something that embarrassed him in hindsight. On his very first day at the hotel, he had looked at Grace and seen only her uniform, nothing more, nothing beneath the surface worth a second glance. Grace considered his words for a moment before answering, her tone gentle rather than accusing. At least, she told him, he had eventually learned to look a second time, when so many others in that hotel never had. He thought about that often in the weeks that followed, how easily people were sorted into categories by nothing more than a uniform or a job title, and how much had nearly been lost simply because almost no one had bothered to look past the surface Grace presented to the world each morning. 6 months later, Grand Wellington completed its full restructuring. Jackson's investment group still moved forward with the acquisition, but the hotel that emerged looked nothing like the one Jason had once presented in the lobby with such practiced confidence. A new board of directors took shape, an independent auditing system was installed, and formal protections for employees who reported wrongdoing were written directly into hotel policy for the first time in its history. Grace became one of the most influential voices guiding that transformation. Employees who had once been too afraid of Jason to speak up began coming forward with additional information, filling in details that strengthened the case against him even further. The fraud investigation moved steadily toward formal prosecution, carried forward by evidence that could no longer be buried behind a locked door or a fabricated personnel file. Jackson and Grace's relationship deepened into something serious, though they kept it quiet and unhurried, never rushing toward anything neither of them was ready for. Neither one saw themselves as having saved the other. Jackson had simply given Grace the chance to bring the truth into the light, and Grace had shown Jackson that no business could ever be judged fairly by its balance sheet alone. One afternoon, Grace received word that renovations on room 312 had finally been completed. Jackson asked what she wanted to do with the space. Grace walked through the door for the first time without a trace of fear weighing on her shoulders. The old mirror was gone entirely, replaced by nothing at all, just open wall and afternoon light spilling freely through the window. She placed a copy of Margaret's letter inside a small keepsake box the hotel kept for meaningful memorabilia, not to preserve the pain of what had happened there, but to honor the woman who had refused to give up on protecting the truth even at the cost of her own final months. The room was returned to ordinary use, just another guest room among hundreds. Grace said quietly that she never wanted it to become some kind of memorial. It was only a room, she said, and her life was the thing that still needed to move forward. Jackson smiled at that, thinking back to the very first night he had seen her sitting on the floor outside that door, tears falling onto a badge that once meant nothing more to him than a uniform detail. 6 months had passed since that night, and Jackson finally understood what he had truly witnessed. He had not seen a desperate housekeeper fall apart under pressure. He had seen a woman fighting quietly and relentlessly to reclaim a name that had been stolen from her. Jackson took Grace's hand as they walked away from room 312 together. The door closed gently behind them, and this time, Grace did not look back. She had spent 3 years glancing over her shoulder, waiting for someone to accuse her all over again, waiting for the past to reach out and pull her under one more time. Now she simply walked forward, steady and unafraid, toward whatever came next. Some people are never given the chance to explain themselves before the world decides who they are. Grace Miller was judged by a uniform, dismissed by a title, and nearly erased by a lie that took 3 years to unravel. But the truth, however deeply buried, has a way of finding the people patient enough to keep looking for it.